There we go. All right, folks. So we have 2 chapters today, and then we're actually at the end of Genesis. It's been a long time, hasn't it?
Over a year. Nope.
All right. So with that, let's jump in. We covered a little bit of this at the end of last time, but I did, as I told you all that I was going to do, I did a little bit more reading into some of these blessings and curses that we get in 49. Feel free to pick out the information you find interesting, but this is one of the things where a lot of it is a description of the tribes as they knew it when this was written, not necessarily descriptions of the sons themselves.
And also the reasons why.
Right.
The rationales.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, jumping in. So, at the end of 48, we have the adoption of Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Israel/Jacob says, okay, I'm going to adopt these sons. Those 2 are going to inherit instead of you, Joseph. That means you get a double share because your 2 sons are going to inherit instead. But then they send the 2 sons off, and here they get the blessings. For the rest of for all of the brothers, and even Joseph is included in the blessings. I have never been able to figure out how to silence this phone. There we go. 2 rings and it's done.
Take the
There we go.
receiver off the hook. Is it a handheld one?
It is, yeah.
Take the receiver
will.
off.
I'm gonna do that for now. All right. Old school phone tricks. All right, so the first one is Reuben, and as we talked about last time, Reuben starts as a blessing, ends as a curse. This relates to the fact that many chapters ago, Reuben entered his father's bed. He never got punished for it at the time, but his father never forgot that Reuben slept with one of the handmaidens of the primary wives. So it wasn't Leah or Rachel, but it was, I believe, Leah's handmaiden.
Yeah, Biala.
Yes. And so this is where he finally gets his retribution, or his comeuppance. Simeon and Levi also have this kind of not quite a blessing. Cursed are you to live by violence. This relates to the fact that these are the 2 that attacked the neighboring tribe after their sister was going to be married to one of them. If you remember that scene, this is once again where that story comes back around, and they're like, you chose violence, so violence you will live by. It seems to be that these 2 also had kind of that more warrior persona within the tribe or within the tribal collection. What is interesting about these 3 is reading in the notes. The tribe of Reuben diminished over time and slowly actually disappeared just as people moved and was absorbed into the tribe of Judah. Similar to Simeon and Levi, they also seem to have kind of dissipated over time. And whether it's intermarrying and joining other clans, Simeon eventually disappears as a tribe, and Levi, as we discussed, becomes scattered because they are the landless priests. So they have an elevated status, but they will never be landowners. And so these 3 tribes over time kind of have this weird status of we have a record of them, but it seems like they either fizzled out, intermarried out of existence, or moved out of existence, which is why we may see here this kind of blessing curse thing in kind of in the way that they're talked about here. So it does seem semi-descriptive. What's up?
I think I might have asked this last week, but I was curious. I can't figure out that Levites were important priests, right? So
yes,
and they were landless because but they disappeared.
Well, It's not that they disappeared, it's that they had a weird status that they
Okay.
didn't have a central tribal land. They were not centralized. So
So-
they
so
they
Still around,
yeah, they were
Right.
disseminated.
yeah, writing the priestly stuff and, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay,
All right.
Priestly over.
So from here on out, you get a lot of like wordplay in some of these blessings and curses and some just reality. So it turns out Judah is a play on the word Yudah, which means praise. And so we like Judah, your name be praised is like praiseworthy person, your name be praised, which is just peak Hebrew poetry right there. We have this beautiful description that's like very poetic about lions crouching down, lionesses, scepters, and you see how it's that poetic nature to it. My notes are saying this is actually possibly one of the oldest sections of Genesis. Just the stylisticness of how it's written in these blessings seems to be very, very old, to the point where some of this poetry we don't actually know fully what it means. So the poetry is our best guess. But even before like the creation stories and all of that, because they can kind of track in the changes of like how language changes, they've tracked this one to be one of the older sections. And it comes out really in this poetic sense that you get in Judah. So Judah has this very eloquent, like you see that the scepter shall not depart. That's an allusion to King David. And because King David comes out of this tribe. And it seems that like there's very powerful language that hints at the monarchy here. And as we go through, you will see that the only thing that comes close to this is the blessings given to Joseph, and that's because Joseph's two sons have the most prosperous areas. So one, you have the political power, and the other one, you have the like fruitful abundance. Then some of these seem kind of like name association with career choices. Zebulun, there we go. That tribe was just close to the shore. They think that it is in some maps landlocked. They think they had trading relations with the Phoenicians. They're just like, okay, you're the sea people, and that's just a description. Similar to the other one of Issachar. That name is related to like it sounds very similar to lending man or like working man. So it is a play on his name, and it seems like that was like a very working class area, which is where you get the blessing, or that area of the blessing. Dan is literally the word judge. So it's judge, you will be the judge over the people. So that's where that association comes from. Dan is like, that is the word for judge. If you see in verse 18, we get this really weird line. If you notice, it doesn't fit into any of the blessings. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. This is a hallmark of the Psalms, actually, which is one of the features where they track this to be very old, is because they think this was a poem or possibly a song, which dates it to be on the older side of things. So this is just a pause. We're going to take a little interlude to give us a break and then go back to the Psalms. Gad is one of those where it's very literally, they think the word relates to what a raiding group was called. So this is a group of raiders that got called raiders. And so raiders, you will be raiding people and you will be raided. If you can see how that their poetry is repetitious, we just don't translate all of it. Asher is another one where they think that this is where a lot of food was grown. Naphtali, I didn't get much of a description of where this association for Naphtali comes from. And then you have the very long description of Joseph with a lot of fertility language, where even part of it says that like the blessing of the father is even greater than the blessing of the mountains. This is a lot of cultic fertility language in the blessing. And so while Joseph is blessed, it is assumed to be transferred onto his sons, which then is why Ephraim and Manasseh become powerful, because this is where a lot of food was grown and they become powerful. And it's seen in this very fertility language poetry. And then Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. There wasn't much description here other than to say that there's a lot of relationship to these blessings to different kinds of animals, and it may have been the personality of the people. And so it says, these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them when he blessed them, blessing each one of them with a suitable blessing. Which is an interesting way to wrap it up, because some of these blessings were actually curses. But this is kind of one of the wrapping, there was one comment that it's like this may have been one ending of the story. If you look at Deuteronomy, Moses ends Deuteronomy with a long speech with blessings and curses, and that's kind of how that story wraps up. So this is almost an ending of the prologue with blessings and curses for the sons that will become the tribes. And so we also know by the time that this is written down, they already know about the 12 tribes of Israel. And so you kind of have that look forward and back in time. So that was a zoom by of the blessings and curses. Was there anything that I skipped over that you wanted to draw out a little bit? Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, it was suggested that since this was written after it had already happened, that insofar as Reuben, Simeon, and Levi are concerned, their transgressions might have been written after the fact and sort of inserted into the narrative to explain why things came out the way they did, and, did Reuben really sleep with his stepmother? Did Simeon and Levi actually massacre all those that did in their sister, and unfortunately, I mean, that sort of thought makes you wonder about the veracity of what you're reading.
Well, that's true of a lot of.
Yeah, so that is an excellent question to bring out. Like, there's no way it's a question we can never fully answer. It's the unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
But one thing you could definitely see, if you have these stories and you have like the thing that happened, you could say, oh yeah, that, like, you can almost like point and create a line where there wasn't a line, where the tribe of Reuben dissipated, and you have this kind of story and you kind of write in the explanation that matches the story that already existed. Make the puzzle pieces match. We know this happens a lot in mythology. We see it very much when like mythology travels. So I know this is tracked with like the Greek and the Roman Empire of like, oh yeah, that story of the sky dad that you have, that's Zeus. I know you call him Odin, but we call him Zeus. And there's kind of this like penciling in to make the stories work kind of a thing. And that may be somewhat what's happening here, is stitching together the story to make your world make sense.
I have a question about Dan, because he's supposed to be the ancestor of David, I gather. And it says he's a snake by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse. But it doesn't sound really positive. So why is he considered a good guy if he's a snake?
That's not okay. I'm gonna click into this a little bit. Being a viper by the roadside, I know that's the association to us doesn't sound good. It's not necessarily bad, is the thing. Let's see, conquest territories. Okay, modern day Joppa. Okay, so let's see. Other information that I'm getting right off the fact is this may have been the first territory to be conquered by Joshua when the people are coming back in. Oh, okay. So this is making somewhat of sense. So in the book of Judges, you have the people who ruled but not as a king. Evidently, a lot of them are coming from the tribe of Dan, which is how they would get the association. All right. I am not actually seeing Dan be related to King David, though.
Oh, I thought it said at the bottom of mine,
Oh, does it?
they were setting something up for David.
Oh, so it's there we go. That's the piece of information. The tribe of Dan was the Dan is the ancestor to the first king of Israel, which is not David, it is King Saul.
Oh,
So
okay.
Saul comes from Dan.
Judah was, and Judah was David.
Yes.
Okay, Judah receives okay, it's a narrative succession. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it's okay. So it's one of those that a viper attacking can be seen as strength. It can be unexpected. Sometimes that is the way justice works, is you need someone to go out and grab. Sometimes the viper hitting has more negative connotations because it's seen as sneaky. Both of these would have been connected to King Saul, who was a sign of strength. For a while, he was a good king, and then he basically went crazy and then became more of the negative connotation. So this may be relating to the relationship with King Saul. That's just a guess. I don't actually know.
Okay.
All right. Any other thoughts of the blessings and curses we get? All right. So keeping moving on, we have the story of kind of how things wrap up then. We have Jacob's death and burial, where this is the end of 49 is seen as the priestly source, where you get the very formalized, he charged them, and you get this small speech, and then he draws up his feet, and the phrase is, he is gathered to his people. This is both a euphemism for like, I'm about to die, but it's used because of the burial practices where you are, yes, going to spiritually be gathered to your people, but your body is going to be hopefully gathered to where your other family members are buried. So jumping in here, we see he charged them saying, I'm about to be gathered to my people, bury me with my ancestors. The cave in the field of Ephraim the Hittite, the cave of the field of Machpelah and Mamre, in the land of the Canaan, in the field that Abraham bought from Ephraim the Hittite as a burial site. That was a mouthful to get out. Anyway, so you all recognize that burial site, right? With all those different descriptors.
Right.
So the information that we get in this next thing, my notes are saying this is the first time we're getting some of this information. So we know Abraham bought this place for Sarah. It seems to also be the burial place for Abraham, because it says Abraham and his wife are buried there. Isaac and his wife Rebecca are buried there. And Jacob buried his wife Leah there. Notably, Rachel is not.
Yeah.
And that is where he wants to be buried. So any thoughts on this, his choice of burial site?
Do we know where he buried Rachel?
Yes,
Tell me, I forgot.
I can't remember. Yeah,
Rachel.
it was a
She
special. I don't
She
remember.
has a tomb unto herself. I know that because I've
Is it Bathsheba?
no.
Oh, okay.
She died when they were traveling somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, along the way. I
So,
thought that was where he got the plot.
mhm. So Rachel is buried outside of Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Currently it's a contentious area because Bethlehem is technically Palestinian territory, and Bethlehem is butts up to where Jerusalem is, and so there's an interesting disputed territory between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and Rachel's tomb is basically sandwiched in between the border there. So it's on the border of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So that's a different place to where the rest of them are buried. Which
But
kind of means, huh?
Rachel was his first wife,
No.
wasn't she?
Was.
Rachel wasn't the first, she was the favorite though.
So he was the second. She was younger, so he had to marry Leah. Was it Leah? First.
Yeah.
He got tricked. He got tricked into marrying
Leah.
Yeah. And he didn't realize it because it was dark.
Mhm.
And he was drunk.
Yeah.
So in the end, Leah gets the last laugh because she is the one who gets to be buried with him. Rachel was always the favorite, but she gets the family tomb.
Okay.
So it's just an interesting detail there. Mary Ellen, you look like you had a thought.
Just reflecting on Rachel, and I don't want to divert the dialogue here, but it seems like Rachel lost out on a lot of things. She couldn't conceive. She had to wait to marry Jacob. You know, she had to deal with Leah. I mean, she may have been the favorite, but she certainly had a hard time. She had a lot of losses.
And I think sometimes that's one of those things where it's a hard life lesson, but we see it in the world of sometimes we look at people and we're like, oh, they're the favorite. But if you scratch the surface, being the favorite's not always easy.
Right.
So, Jacob charges his son to do that. He pulls up his feet, he breathes his last, and he was gathered to his people. So that's one where we see the metaphorical gathered to his people, but he's charged his son to physically gather him and take him to the people. What's interesting is what Joseph then does. So starting in 50, this is seen to be a different tradition, but they're very well stitched together. It's very seamless, but they notice the language shift here. But Joseph throws himself on his father's face, weeps over him, kisses him. But then it seems like he is going to employ all the honors that Egyptians can give. So he embalms his father in a process that is 40 days long, which is hinted at. This actually might be the fact that Joseph had him like properly Egyptian mummified, is what that seems to be a hint of.
Mm-hmm.
Which not ever, despite our associations with Egypt, commoners didn't necessarily get the full mummification practices. There was probably a lesser one, but 40 days of it means that he got all the rites and the rituals done.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just that Joseph paid to get him mummified and had this 40-day ritual. After the days of weeping were past, he goes to Pharaoh, and he talks to Pharaoh saying, hey, I've been charged to take my dad home to the family grave. Can I go? Pharaoh gives permission, get up and go. And so Joseph goes. The elders of his household go. The elders of the land of Egypt go. His brothers go. His father's house goes. And only the children and the flocks and the herd were left in Goshen. Both chariots and charioteers went up with him, and it was a great company. What do you all think of this big old parade?
Didn't you say it was like a couple days journey away?
It would be faster if they were in chariots. That's the one detail where it's probably it's the difference between, I would say, like driving somewhere and taking the airplane somewhere. Chariots are gonna be faster, but Pharaoh allowed the chariots to go.
So would they make it then in one day, or would it be a longer journey? I mean, I'm trying to figure out all these people and all the logistics of these people traveling a distance and then returning. Is it a short journey or a long journey, or is this simply poetic?
There's likely a bit of poetry and exaggeration, undoubtedly, but if we're working within the story itself, this is at least a month, I would say. But if you're walking, that takes significantly longer. That would be a couple of months, if not like a year process. The chariots and the charioteers, that may be insurance that Joseph goes and comes back faster. So this is still not like a day trip. It's not like we're gonna get there, leave in the morning, we're gonna get there in the night. It's still gonna be a process to move everyone out that way and come back.
And leave Egypt without all these people for all this time.
Yep.
When did the idea that you should bury your dead within a day come? Because certainly if you're, Jews don't embalm, and they mostly, I don't think, and they put the bodies in the ground as fast as they can. That's a later development, I'm assuming.
Not necessarily. I think that's why Rachel's not buried in the family tomb, is because she wasn't embalmed.
Okay.
Getting Joseph embalming his father allows them to take the trip, because he's basically mummified. So transporting a mummy is going to be a lot easier than a smelly, decomposing body.
Yeah, I think the mummy is better embalmed than what we do now.
Yeah. So I think in a world without refrigerators or formaldehyde as an option, that's when you very much need to have a quick turnover. It's one of the things that our death practices are radically different now, that we can stop the decomposition of humans, which allows us to take our time in a way that's just very different. And especially with the practices of cremation, that very much changes timescales and like how fast do you have to do a funeral, how fast do you have to deal with the remains. That whole thing is very different. Even like, I mean, a couple hundred years ago would be very different. So what's interesting though is, if you remember, Cana, the land of Cana, is a backwater country place. And all of a sudden a bunch of Egyptian chariots show up to this random field that they know is owned by a dude, but like the family hasn't been here in a while, and a bunch of Egyptian chariots show up with a mummy, and time to put the mummy in the family burial spot. And there's the comment in verse 11, the Canaanites inhabiting the land saw the mourners on the threshing floor of Atad, and they said, "This is grievous mourning on the part of the Egyptians. Therefore the place is named Abel Mizraim, which means Egypt, the mourning of Egypt." So this does seem, there's record in the naming that a large group of Egyptians came here, and they just named the spot like, well, this is where Egyptians mourned. Notable enough that they came here in all their finery. So they carried him, they buried him in the cave, and we get the description again, which Abraham had bought for a burial site from Ephraim the Hittite. And after he buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with all of his brothers and all who had gone to him to bury his father. So notably, I believe at this point, the famine has passed, but everyone still goes back to Egypt. Their flocks are there, the rest of their families are there, like they are set up camp. But this wasn't seen as an excuse to return to Cana. They go to Cana and then they return. Did you all pick up on that detail?
Yeah.
So why return?
The family.
They left all the kids there.
Yeah, the little ones were left along with their flocks.
Mhm.
Would this Egyptian entourage also function as an escort to make sure they do return?
Yes.
Yes.
Undoubtedly, this is an insurance policy that Joseph comes back. And so this is where, after they return, we get this final interaction between Joseph and his brothers. And I think this is often what we think about when we're, I remember you all brought up when Joseph revealed himself a few chapters back, and you're like, wait, this wasn't the story of forgiveness I remember. I think what you all possibly were remembering was this part of the story. So the brothers realize their father's dead. Therefore, almost that protection of like don't do anything bad in front of dad is gone. And they start panicking, wondering like, oh, wait, did Joseph just hang around till dad was gone to do something? Are we in trouble? Do we need to do we need to worry about our status? Because like Joseph could potentially be unhinged now. Like, what's holding him back? And so they come up with one last deception, and they said, your father gave us the instructions before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you to forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Please forgive the crimes of the servants of God, of the God of your father. So they're like, Dad said to forgive us, please. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, you know, right up until the end, they do not understand the changes in Joseph and the basic goodness that he has become, and they're putting their own what they would do in a situation, projecting it onto him. And we never really got the whole picture, the whole point. They're always wrapped up in how they would handle things and then worrying and projecting it on Joseph. Kind of sad, you know, they never really saw the light.
I think there's a general life lesson to see this in people, though, that often we project what we would do onto other people. And sometimes when we're worried about people doing us wrong, we need to think if that is their character or if we're worried that that's what we would do, and it actually says something about us. And we see this a little bit in some of our national conversation, when you're seeing how, like, with the polarization, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but when you look at what each side is saying about the other one, sometimes one side of the conversation is projecting how they would act onto the other one, and vice versa. That the sins of the other side are actually the things that they know they are capable of. And I think it's something to keep in mind always when we are operating. If we have a fear that someone's going to do something, is that because that's what we would do? Or sometimes I guess the reverse. There's situations where the reverse is true, where someone expects you to do, like, that your reaction will be some. Have you ever had it where they're almost trying to preempt your reaction and you find out what they think you're going to do and you're like, no? Why would you think I would do that? That's not me. But you realize it's what they would have done.
Yeah.
Have you all had these situations where there's projection?
Mhm.
You've had situations where somebody's angry about something because you didn't do Y and Z, and you didn't know you were supposed to do X, Y, and Z because that was something they were wanting you to do, that you were clueless, that that's one of their expectations. And I've ended up in big trouble and I didn't even know what I was in trouble for.
How dare you not read my mind and know what you were supposed to do?
And then act on what I expect you to do without me telling you.
Any other thoughts? I saw some head nods of like, yeah, we've either been projected onto or accidentally projected onto people. It's a human thing to do. And
It seems pretty commonplace to accuse your opponent, or whatever you want to say, adversary, of what you're doing. And that seems to be what causes a lot of conflict.
Mhm.
And you call somebody a racist because you know when you're inside you're the racist, and
Right.
or terms like that.
Mhm.
It's kind of interesting that you look at it through this Genesis.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so, yeah, these brothers are having a really hard time trusting that Joseph isn't going to react like they would. They
Right.
almost cannot imagine a world where there isn't retribution, which is a sad way to be in the world.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Joseph keeps saying, it was for the better. God had another plan. We
Uh-huh.
say, he said it before. They didn't hear him. Well, it's a repetition.
Yeah. And so it says Joseph wept when they spoke to him. So they're saying like, Dad says to forgive us, please, and he's just crying. Like it must actually hurt to have forgiven your brothers and see that they aren't hearing you. Like they aren't accepting your fruit. Like it's almost a rejection of his forgiveness at this point of like, really? We're still at this point?
Mhm.
And so in the final completion of Joseph's dreams, his brothers fall down before him and say, "We are your servants." Which is just like, so we've had the wheat bowing down, there was the sun, moon, and stars bowing down, and now here the brothers are groveling at his feet saying, "We will do anything. We will be your servants. Please do not hurt us." But Joseph comes back saying, wait, yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I just had a question. The number 11 just kind of struck me as back to one of Joseph's first dreams. Did the number of 11 come in there as well? They were going to bow down to him, or that kind of.
Right in the beginning. That's how he got in trouble with his.
With that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was I believe the first dream was the 11 sheaths of grain bowing down to him.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so,
Thing that I was thinking back, so how dumb was he that he would share that dream?
Well, he wasn't.
We wouldn't have the story if he didn't have that.
Right.
yeah, Larry, what were you going to say?
Joseph had a big ego back then. No, what I was going to say was, in Joseph told them about the dream. Then when the brothers first came to Egypt, they did bow down to him, but they didn't know it was Joseph.
Right.
Yeah, this is the time now when they are finally bowing down to him and they know it's Joseph.
That's
Makes a good story.
Yes.
Right. And so this is once again destiny, free will, choice. So Sue, your comment of like, it probably wasn't a good idea to share the dream, but sharing the dream is what made the dream come true in a way.
Yes.
That if he didn't share it, he wouldn't have gotten in trouble, and it wouldn't have
Right.
happened.
Yes, yes, I see that.
So is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like what?
Well, you know, I guess I was thinking of that I would be very careful about sharing something that I thought would get me killed.
So Joseph's response is, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear, I myself will provide for you and your little ones. What do you think of that response? Is that the forgiveness we were looking for?
Yeah, he's already said that before. Yeah.
So what do you think of this phrase? What you intended for harm, God has intended for good.
Yeah.
Is there other ways we can look in the world and say that and kind of reframe things? What others have intended for harm, God has intended for good.
You're thinking of another event we could label like that?
I don't know. That's just one that I like that phrase, and I'm curious what it brings up. Yeah, Larry?
We burned up a lot of innocent Japanese with the atom bomb, but it did end the war.
Well, they didn't need to do it twice. Well, the other thing is that, you know, the Second World War united Europe. I don't think that was God's, I don't know. I mean, there have been good outcomes to calamities, but that's not necessary. I don't think we could say that ahead of time that was the purpose. So I don't, it depends on what, I guess, you believe in God's power and planning ahead of time. John would say it was planned in the beginning of the world.
But so isn't it a core element of the faith that even horrible things, if you just be patient and hang in there, there could or will become a positive factor.
Yeah.
It's basic to faith, I think, that even horrible things can eventually work out to have some benefit.
So in our own lives, I know there's times that I look back and say, I'm so glad I didn't get what I wanted.
Oh, yeah. Be careful what you ask for.
And that's where I see like, oh, yeah, that hurt. And it may have been intended for harm, but in my life, it worked out better because of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would say that was true about my career. I just sort of fell into it, and it wasn't, I went to a school that wasn't my first choice or I really even knew about. And it was the best school. And things do happen that way. And a lot of people are very good at reframing, looking at things differently.
Because that's ultimately what Joseph is doing here. He's reframing a situation. As you all know, I'm not the biggest fan of everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
But I can go with what you intended for harm, God has intended for good. Because that means that, like, it's not a denial that the bad things are bad, but it's a reframing of, I can see the good that came out of this bad thing. Which is closer to like redemption. This bad thing can be redeemed into something that is good.
Mhm.
So with the forgiveness being clearly stated, no, even though dad's gone, I'm not gonna exact revenge. Look, this turned out for the best. People have lived or more people have lived because of this. I'm going to choose to look at the good of this situation. And so Joseph remained in Egypt and his father's household, and he lives 110 years. He sees one of his sons to the third generation. Manasseh was also born on Joseph's knee, which is just saying that Joseph was there and saw the birth. And then I was curious about the phrase that it says, and Joseph said to his brothers, which makes me wonder, are his brothers older than him?
Oh, yeah.
This seems to imply his brother's family, not necessarily his brothers themselves.
Oh, wait, aren't his two sons now his brothers?
Yes. So the hint comes a little ways down because this is the first time we see a very specific word. So yes, his sons are his brothers. He gathered his brothers, but it seems to be the entire household because Joseph made the Israelites swear. Using the term Israelites implies that this has a sense of nationhood. We won't see this term again for a long time, but Israelites mean that they are the company of Israel, which means he is talking to the clan, like the entirety of the clan, which is interesting. But this is where he says, I'm about to die. God will surely come to you and bring you up out of the land. What kind of language are you hearing with a phrase like that of God will come to you and bring you up out of the land?
The prophetic of Moses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Has the perception of God changed somewhat?
Maybe not. What are you picking up on?
Well, that God would come to you rather than he's already there walking around in the garden. I mean, it's a little less, it's a little more universal.
So this is one where I would actually say the location matters because I'm pulling it out now because I want you to hear it in the Exodus story of saying that God will come to you.
Yeah.
Means that like, where is God right now?
Okay.
And I can't say definitively, but that has a sense of like the presence will arrive. And you will know when the presence arrives and like summons you out.
Okay.
And he's talking to all the people, not just to his physical brothers.
Right. Yeah, this is being addressed to the Israelites.
Israelites, yeah.
Which means,
and they know they're living in a foreign country. Well, they've been there 110 years or more,
give or
more,
take, yeah.
A couple of 100 years, which you'd think they'd be settled by that time, but maybe not.
They likely are settled. This is like 2 or 3 generations we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And remember, when it talks about like the households, like we saw like moments ago when it said like the brothers and their households went to bury the father, that's an implication of servants or people who work for you. This is still like the small businesses are there, and so the Israelites even encompass that group of people. So this it's not just the heads of the households, it's not just the brothers, it is the brothers, their sons, their families, and the people that are like the household included the people that were kind of lower than the family status but still a part of the family because the family cared for them. That is the Israelites, which you can start to see how that number can multiply a lot faster than just 12 brothers. It's 12 brothers and
Right.
they're like staff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. The other thing it illustrates is the strong bond to your country of source. You know, like Jacob wanting to be buried with his back in Canaan, and the Israelites feel a strong force coming from someplace other than where they're living at the current time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. They don't want to like eat, despite how like integrated Joseph has become to Egyptian society to the point where it seems like he just regularly passes as an Egyptian.
Mhm.
He still doesn't want to stay there. There is that very strong connection. When I die, bring me out of here.
Mhm.
And
Get me
so gather my bones,
Mhm.
haul me out of here when God comes. When God summons you all to leave, bring me with you. And so that
Does he
is what
that all of the Israelites should leave when he dies?
No.
it says when God comes to you.
Okay.
Notably, Hebrew is a weird language when it comes to time. They actually don't have a present, a past, or a future tense. Their tense is changed by who's doing the acting in it, so time is kind of inferred, which is an interesting choice when you're developing a language, but it is postulated that it's just like when God comes, at the indefinite time that like God is going to show up, that's when you're going to bring me out of Egypt. It's not like his father, where his father died and immediately Joseph's like, hey, I got to bury dad. It's kind of like, we're going to leave together kind of a thing.
Mhm.
And then the entirety of the book of Genesis wraps up saying Joseph died being 110 years old, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. That's it. End of story. What do we think?
That's interesting. Now, I obviously from after Joseph died, the fortunes of the Israelites didn't improve. They became eventually what, slaves?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So the beginning of Exodus will address
So-
that base, as if I remember, it addresses it basically right away. You have a little bit of lineage, and then you get into how things are not as they were at the end of the last book. At the end of Genesis, the story, or like where you leave off, is like things look pretty good. They have a bunch of land. They got to bury dad in the proper way. They buried dad with all the honors, chariots and everything. What happens?
Well, we had to figure out a story that had to explain the founding of Israel.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you're talking about another 110 years,
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
the time Jacob dies until Joseph dies.
It's not that much time in between. Is it another 110 or?
It says that Joseph was 110, which
Or
probably mean
I thought it said he lived 110 years.
yeah, total.
That means,
Oh,
okay.
total?
Yeah, total, not just after that point. That's a total.
Oh, I thought it was that.
Yeah. But still, it's a significant portion of time that has elapsed. So we'll have a little bit of time with this next week, but I'm curious about your reflections over how the entirety of the book of Genesis flows. Starting from like that very episodic starting narrative to the beginning of the Abraham story that eventually flows into the Joseph story. What are your thoughts now that we've gotten to the end and Genesis is a lot to take on. You all have been amazing with this, but what do you think about the flow of the entirety of the book?
It was hilly country.
Yeah.
There were lots of ups and downs.
Uh-huh.
Well, it certainly covered an extremely long period of time. I don't know of any other book that's covered that much time.
Yeah, and it doesn't, I just read the footnotes on Exodus last night, or as much as I could before I fell asleep. Where they make a big issue out of, is this true? Is no evidence of what happened in Exodus. Not much. Maybe there was a small group of people that left Egypt, but they don't make, there's not so much of that kind of thing going on in Genesis. I guess the assumption is that none of it's mostly mythology. There's no well, I don't know what your son.
So
Much footnotes.
the truth, I think asking, this is my honest opinion, so this is Chris Hallam interpretation. You all don't have to hold to this. This is just how I look at it. Is asking how much of it is true is the wrong question.
Yes.
Because
Reading that in Exodus, I was surprised because, you know, I've only recently, well, it's fairly recent, I think, I've been reading that about that. I never thought it was, I never really asked that question. The question was always, did Jesus really live? Not whether Moses really lived.
The thing that we can see, and this applies both to Genesis and what we're going to be doing in Exodus, is something happened.
Yes.
That is the one thing I will hold to, is that something happened.
Yes.
That I do not believe that these stories were made up whole cloth. I don't believe that of any mythology, if I'm being honest. Mythology always seems to be centered around something. Even if there's fantastical stories, we know that they are building stories out of stories they know, which means at some point there is a connection.
And the world was created in some way. It started someplace.
And so I generally believe that probably there was a dude named Abraham. Did he do everything that's in this text? I don't know. That may be a composite character where they took a bunch of stories of a righteous person and they smushed them together. Did Joseph actually exist? Probably someone similar did. Did he do all those things? I don't know. And so it's weird that there is definitely kernels of truth, but we don't know where the boundaries of truth and mythology intersect. Which is why, if you notice, my question is always like, where are the human elements that we can still relate to? Because there's a reason why we are still reading these ancient stories, and these are truly ancient. And yet we're going back to them again and again, not because we're learning from them like a history book, but because there's an emotional truth in them.
Yeah.
And so that's where I see of like, not what is history, but what is true. Yeah, Larry?
And a great number of people over a very long period of time managed to put that together and into what we've got, which is the Bible, you know, and, you know, you have to look at it sort of that way. You can't say it was written by one guy and we can hold him to account as to whether or not he's telling the truth. You know, the input into this came from multitude.
Yeah.
Well, also, when did written language come into play? Certainly was a lot later than these things supposedly took place. And these are stories that were told orally for a long time. And you know what happens to oral stories? They get better as it goes along. So, you know, it's just one of those things that we can't know how much as far as physically true. But is that important? Do we have to know that they actually lived? I don't think we have to know that.
I think there has been a certain mystery specifically about the stories we are going to talk about. Like the images are going to, Genesis is not always abundant in detail, but Exodus, we will see much more fleshed out stories. And I think there's just an intriguing part of the image of them that we want to find it, because the images are almost like we can hold on to them a little bit easier. In the same way that like the image of the ark, like that one, like we have a good mental image of what that might be like, which is why we've always searched for something like that. The things that we can imagine in our heads, I almost wonder if that draws us to like looking for the evidence a little bit more, because we know what we want to see. So one last way to think about this story and thinking about the how we're set up for Exodus. If you notice how as Genesis went, the stories kind of got longer and longer as it went, where at first it's very much an anthology of just like little tidbits. And then we would get longer stories where like a whole chapter would be a story. Then we get like Abraham, where he's very much like a TV episode, like we get this episode of Abraham and this episode, and it lasts a bit longer. And then the end of the book being like all Joseph, and you see how that story stretches out. And now it makes sense for Exodus. It is one story and it is the whole book. So you can see how the stories grow in length. And now we are like, okay, let's tell a big story. We got all the setup here for all the little stories. Let's tell the big story now. So, any other final thoughts for Genesis? Or are we like, thank goodness it's done? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Two things will always stick in my mind. One, the description of creation, and when you showed the images of the dome of, you know, the whole thing, that just will always stick with me. But I think my major reaction to all of Genesis is the God of Genesis is not the God I have known. He is frequently in human form. He is here and then he's there. And not the I don't remember what the word, oh, it's snowing outside. Anyways, that he is just I don't know how to describe what I'm feeling, but maybe you can put it in better words than I can. But that will stick with me as an overall impression of Genesis.
So there is a thought that I was reading, or it was a podcast. I was listening to it. And granted, this wasn't about the Christian story. This was, once again, I really like mythology, and so is mythology based. And one of the things in the story was like death appears to people in the way that people understand. So it was talking about Irish and Scottish mythology, and death appears to this character in the form of Scottish mythology. And it's not to say that like death inhabited is that form, but it's one of those that it uses that form as this like abstract concept in order to relate to us, or to relate to that character in a way that they could kind of interface, that their brain wouldn't explode, that it would make sense of things. In that same story, wisdom appeared in the form of an owl because that's how they imagined wisdom and fate to look. And your comment, Mary Ellen, makes me think of that, of, are there times that God relates to us in a way that makes culturally sense to us? Not because that is the definitive shape of God, but that's because how we already understand, and God meets us where we understand. So God's gonna look different person to person because God relates to us basically in our own language, in our own mental language. And I think if we're reading a story and God doesn't really make sense to us in the way that God is showing up in these stories, you know, there's something to that. And I think it's good to point out that we don't really think about God as walking around. But if people expect God to be walking around, does God show up walking around because that's what they expect? And therefore, God has to kind of work within our expectations a little bit while still challenging them.
Good point.
So I think there's a way to make sense of it, but I do, your observation, Mary Ellen, is, you're not the first person to like bring that out. There's actually a heresy in the early Christian church. I think it's called Marcionism, that literally looked at the Old Testament and said, this is not the same as Jesus. Like, these are two different gods, and disavowed the entirety of the Old Testament, said, nope, that's not true. And they were declared heretics, and got murdered because of it. But we still see this today, this kind of observation, because people often look to the stories of the Old Testament saying that God is very different from what we see in the gospel. Therefore, they can't be the same. Or people saying, I don't like those Old Testament stories. God is so vengeful and wrathful in the Old Testament stories. But it's trying to make sense, because in the end, we smack them together.
Sorry about that.
No worries. If that's an alarm, we can wrap up and let you all go for the day. All right.
The end.
And I will let it open for any last concluding thoughts.
Thanks.
All right. Shall we pray out for today?
Yes.
All right. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks. Especially today, we give you thanks that so many people over the centuries upon centuries have taken the time to write stories about you, about how they interacted with you, how you interacted in their lives. Stories that were collected and assembled, stories that were stitched together to make a narrative where we see both grace and love, justice and accountability, where we see people struggling and people questioning and people falling short and people rising up as well. God, we know the stories of Genesis are old, and yet we delight that we have found you in their pages, and a lot of questions that we will never find answers to until we can talk to you face to face, but also found questions to help us ponder our own life and learn from the wisdom of the people who collected these stories. So we give you thanks for all those who told stories around campfires, for the people who had the wisdom to write down those stories when it came time, the people who saved those stories and made copies upon copies, making sure that the stories would be passed from generation to generation, and the people who printed them on paper that we read today. We give you thanks for all of these people. And especially I give you thanks for this group who has spent the time to look at those stories, who spent the time asking questions and digging in, that we might find you there again today and in the weeks past and in the weeks to come. So I ask that you give them blessing, that these stories may come alive and that they may see new connections in them day by day, that these stories might travel with them and impact them continually as you continue to be in our lives, making new stories that we are also to share. So with grateful hearts we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Chris.
Hey, thank you
Chris.
for making Genesis so enjoyable.
Oh, good. Genesis is genuinely one of my favorite books. It takes a long time to work through, but I'm so happy that you all were willing to go there with me. I love this book so much. Oh, all right.